He could still remember the first time he realized that things were falling apart. They had been together for nearly 2 years, and at first everything seemed perfect. They laughed at the same jokes, shared the same hobbies, and even had dreams that seemed to fit together. But lately, there had been tension, arguments that started over small things and escalated quickly. He had tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a phase, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The day she ended it was quiet, almost calm, but it hit him harder than he expected. She didn't yell or accuse him. She just looked at him with tired eyes and said she couldn't do it anymore, that her feelings had changed. He felt a cold rush of disbelief and anger. How could someone who had promised to stay suddenly walk away without a fight? He wanted to shout, to beg, to cry, but all he managed was to sit there in silence as she gathered her things and left. The next few days were a blur. He couldn't focus on work, he couldn't sleep properly, and even eating felt meaningless. Every time his phone buzzed, he hoped it was her, and when it wasn't, his stomach twisted. He tried talking to friends, but the words felt empty. They told him to move on, to forget her, but he didn't want to. He needed answers, closure, or maybe just one more moment with her. Then came the anger. At first it was quiet, simmering beneath the surface, but it grew. He started replaying every conversation in his head, thinking about every little mistake, every argument, every time he thought she was happy with him. And slowly, he convinced himself that she was the problem, that she had been careless with his feelings, that she had left him without reason. The sense of injustice became unbearable. One night he found himself staring at his phone for hours, typing messages and then deleting them. He wanted to tell her how wrong she was, how much he had sacrificed, how she couldn't just walk away. The messages were angry, desperate, and pleading all at once. Finally, he pressed send on one, a simple line meant to warn her not to move on too quickly, not to make choices that might hurt her. At first, he didn't expect a response. Then she replied. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten him back. Her words were calm and firm, asking him to stop, to respect her decision. But instead of calming him down, it fueled him further. How could she be so calm when he was falling apart? How could she be living her life when he was stuck in this nightmare? Over the next few days, his messages became more frequent, more pointed. He tried to warn her, tried to make her feel the fear he felt, but deep down he knew it was wrong. Still, he couldn't stop. Every time he imagined her laughing with someone else, he felt a burning jealousy and an unbearable ache in his chest. He knew it wasn't fair, but he couldn't control his thoughts. She started ignoring his messages eventually, blocking him when she felt it was too much. That only made him more obsessed. He began watching from a distance, noticing her routine, wondering who she was spending time with, trying to catch any hint that she was moving on. His friends noticed the change. They could see the tension in his shoulders, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he clenched his fists when she came up in conversation. They warned him, but he brushed it off, convinced that he was only trying to protect himself, to defend his feelings. One evening, he drove past the coffee shop where she often went with friends. He didn't go inside. He just parked across the street and watched. He saw her smile at someone, a man he didn't recognize. His heart sank and a wave of panic and anger hit him. He didn't know who this person was, but the thought of her laughing and talking with him sent a shiver down his spine. That night, he barely slept. Every thought was about her and the man he had seen. He imagined confrontations, arguments, and even threats. The obsession was taking over his life. His mind raced with scenarios. What if he approached her? What if he told her she was making a mistake? What if he could somehow make her fear him enough to stop seeing anyone else? He hated that he was thinking this way, hated that he wanted to control her life, but the jealousy and hurt were stronger than reason. He kept telling himself he wasn't a bad person, that he was just scared and angry. But even he knew deep down that his actions were crossing a line. Every day he checked her social media, looking for clues, obsessing over every post, every comment, every picture. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself he was just making sure she was safe, that he still cared. But the reality was harsher. He wasn't thinking about her safety. He was thinking about his own pain and how he could make it stop by making her feel something, fear, regret, or even guilt. One night, he sat in his car parked outside her street and tried to calm himself down. The cool night air did little to ease the tension in his chest. He thought about the life they had shared, the inside jokes, the late-night conversations, the promises. And then he thought about her with someone else, happy and smiling, and the rage came back stronger than ever. He wanted to scream, to shake the world until she felt what he felt. The temptation to send another message, to make a threat, to try and scare her was overwhelming. He remembered the warnings from his friends, the signs that he was losing control. He knew that if he kept going down this path, he could ruin his life completely. But the pull of obsession was too strong. He justified it in his mind, telling himself that he was only trying to protect the love they had once shared, that he couldn't just let her walk away and be happy with someone else. It was a dangerous thought, but it consumed him. In the end, he found himself at a crossroads. He could continue down this path, sending messages, making threats, and risking everything he had, or he could stop, walk away, and try to heal. But the fear of losing her completely, of seeing her with someone else, kept him trapped in a cycle of anger, jealousy, and obsession. Every night he lay awake thinking of what she was doing, who she was with, and how powerless he felt. He realized that he was no longer thinking about her as a person, but as a symbol of everything he had lost. He was punishing her for moving on, even though he knew it wasn't her fault. It was a painful truth, one that made him feel both guilty and angry at himself. And yet, despite knowing how wrong it was, he couldn't stop. The heartbreak had turned into something darker, something he didn't recognize in himself. And so the stage was set. His obsession was growing. His anger was simmering, and his actions were starting to cross boundaries that he might later regret. The warning signs were all there, but in the fog of heartbreak and jealousy, he didn't see them clearly. He was caught in a storm of his own making, and the events that would follow were about to take him further down a path he couldn't yet imagine. He tried to convince himself that he could move on, that the constant thoughts of her would fade, but every attempt failed. He spent days thinking about what she was doing, replaying every memory they had shared and wondering if she was already seeing someone else. The fear of her being with another man became an obsession, gnawing at him day and night. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't enjoy the small moments in life, and even the simplest tasks felt heavy with anxiety. She, on the other hand, was slowly reclaiming her life. After the breakup, she decided to spend more time with friends, focusing on hobbies and activities she had neglected. There was a quiet strength in her, a determination to heal and to move forward. She went for walks, met new people, and allowed herself to smile again. Despite the past, she didn't want to carry bitterness in her heart. She knew it would take time, but she believed she could find happiness again. One evening, she mentioned a new friend she had met. A man who was polite, confident, and genuinely kind. He made her laugh in a way she hadn't in months. He listened when she spoke, valued her thoughts, and made her feel safe. She wasn't thinking about him in a serious way yet, but his presence was comforting, a reminder that the world still held good people. He had no idea about this man at first. His nights were spent scouring social media, checking her posts for any sign of someone new, and imagining scenarios that made his stomach turn. Then one afternoon, through a mutual friend, he learned a name. At first, he didn't think much of it, but when he heard more details, his chest tightened. She was spending time with someone he could never have anticipated. The thought hit him like a punch. She had moved on faster than he ever imagined. Curiosity mixed with fear took over. He began to investigate quietly, wanting to know everything about this new person. Friends, coworkers, even strangers online. He looked for information wherever he could. Every little piece he found made his heart race, and a mix of jealousy and panic consumed him. He couldn't understand how she could laugh again, how she could open her heart to someone else, while he was still trapped in pain. He pictured her sitting across from the new man in a cafe, smiling and sharing stories. His mind created every detail, every laugh, every gesture, until it felt unbearably real. The anger rose inside him, but so did something else, a creeping sense of fear. This wasn't just a stranger. There was something different about the way people spoke of him, the way others seemed to respect him. He realized that he didn't just feel jealousy. He felt powerless. His friends noticed the shift in him. He had become quieter, more tense. The obsessive thoughts weren't hidden anymore. They tried talking to him, reminding him of the danger of letting anger and jealousy control him. They warned him that if he tried to interfere, if he threatened her again, the consequences could be serious. He nodded, but their words barely registered. He was already deep into the spiral. thinking only of her and the man she was seeing. Then came the first accidental encounter. He was at a store when he saw them together, laughing at something she said. The new man's presence was calm and strong, and he treated her with genuine care. Seeing them together made him feel a cold, sinking fear. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was the realization that he had been out of her life, powerless, and she didn't need him anymore. He parked across the street for a long time, watching them from a distance. She seemed happy, completely at ease. The sight made his chest tighten, his thoughts spin, and he had to remind himself to breathe. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his own actions, the threats, the obsessive messages, the attempts to control her. And now, seeing how happy she could be without him, he wondered if he had gone too far. Days passed, and he continued to watch from afar. He learned more about the new man through social media and mutual acquaintances. He found out that he had a strong reputation at work, respected by colleagues and even admired by people he didn't know personally. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't someone to intimidate or scare. The anger that had fueled his obsession now mixed with fear. He had crossed lines, and now the person she was with could handle things far differently than he could imagine. The obsession didn't disappear, but it changed. Anger was now joined by dread. He imagined scenarios where he confronted her, where he sent another threatening message, and each time he pictured the new man stepping in with calm authority, ending the confrontation with a single word. The thought made him shiver. He had never felt so small, so powerless. He began to withdraw, avoiding friends and family, spending hours alone in his apartment. The walls seemed to close in on him as he replayed memories and imagined the new man's presence. He was trapped between the desire to reach out and the fear of the consequences. Every time he typed a message to her, he hesitated, deleted it, and stared at the blank screen, his fingers trembling. One evening, he decided to follow a route she often took. He didn't know what he expected to find. Proof that she still cared for him, or maybe confirmation that she had truly moved on. He followed her at a distance, careful not to be seen. She walked with the new man, their conversation animated and filled with laughter. Seeing them together was like a knife twisting in his chest. He wanted to call her, to warn her, to take back control, but fear stopped him. The new man's calm, confident demeanor was intimidating, and he couldn't imagine what would happen if he tried anything. He spent that night awake, thinking of all the moments he had lost, all the chances he had squandered, and the person she had found to fill the space he once occupied. His mind raced with a mix of regret, jealousy, and growing fear. The man she was with wasn't just someone new. He represented stability, protection, and strength. It was everything he had lacked in himself. As the days turned into weeks, he watched silently from a distance, trying to make sense of his emotions. He realized that he couldn't act on his obsession without risking his own life and freedom. The fear of consequences became stronger than the desire to control her. He knew he had to change, at least enough to survive. But letting go of the anger and jealousy felt impossible. He began to understand, in small painful pieces, that she had moved on, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she had the right to find happiness. The new man wasn't a replacement. He was a reminder that life continued even when someone left, and he had a choice. Continue down a dangerous path or step back and try to find himself again. The part of him that had once sent threats and chased shadows now trembled at the thought of crossing that line again. Every message he considered sending, every step toward her, was now met with dread. He felt trapped by his own past actions, realizing that he had painted himself into a corner. Even as he watched her from afar, a strange sense of clarity began to emerge. He didn't want to hurt her, even if his jealousy screamed otherwise. He wanted to survive his own obsession, to find a way back to normalcy, and perhaps one day learn to let go completely. The realization was both humbling and frightening, a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. He had begun to understand that he could no longer act impulsively, that any contact with her could spiral into disaster. But understanding did not stop the restless thoughts that haunted him day and night. Each morning he woke with the same anxiety, checking his phone, hoping for nothing but still fearing everything. He knew that his obsession was dangerous, yet he could not escape it. One afternoon he received a message from someone he didn't expect, a friend of a friend warning him about his behavior. The words were gentle but serious, telling him that his messages, his watching, and his attempts to control her life were becoming alarming. At first he felt anger, a sense of being unfairly judged, but soon it turned into fear. They had seen enough to be concerned, and that realization hit harder than he expected. He tried to convince himself that he was being careful, that his observations were harmless, but the warning lingered in his mind. He began to notice other signs of trouble, people looking at him differently, neighbors asking questions, even subtle messages on social media that suggested someone was paying attention to his actions. Every small detail fed his anxiety. He had also noticed the new man in her life more often, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes through deliberate observation. The way he carried himself, the respect people seemed to give him, and the quiet strength that radiated from him terrified the ex-boyfriend. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was fear. This was someone he could not confront, someone who would not be intimidated. Late one evening, he was walking through a quiet part of town when he noticed a car following him. At first he thought it was a coincidence, but the pattern repeated over the next few nights. The fear of being watched, of being held accountable, began to creep into his mind. He imagined that someone might report him to the authorities or even confront him directly. The once tempting thought of threatening her again was replaced by a new fear, one that left him sleepless and paranoid. The tension affected his relationships. Friends he had leaned on for support began to distance themselves, some unsure how to deal with the intensity of his obsession. Conversations became strained, casual jokes lost their charm, and his isolation grew. The more he withdrew, the more his thoughts turned inward, replaying his failures, his anger, and the reality that he had pushed himself to the edge of a dangerous path. At work, he struggled to concentrate. His colleagues noticed the shift in his demeanor, the tightness in his jaw, the distant look in his eyes. He tried to hide it, but the strain was visible. Every time his phone buzzed, a wave of panic washed over him. Was it her? Was it a warning? Was someone finally taking notice of him? The uncertainty was unbearable. Then came the first tangible consequence. He had sent a brief message, one that seemed harmless at the time, but it was interpreted as a threat. Her friend, someone who had been aware of his past behavior, decided to act. They contacted authorities, explaining that his messages, combined with his known pattern of obsession, could pose a risk. The reality of the situation hit him like a cold wave. He had never considered that someone would involve the law, and now that it had happened, fear overwhelmed every other emotion. The news of potential legal trouble forced him to confront his actions. He began to see clearly the danger he had created for himself, the threats, the constant watching, the obsession with her new relationship. Each had built a web that he could no longer escape from easily. Fear became his constant companion. Every step outside felt risky, every social interaction a potential trap. He thought about apologizing, reaching out to explain himself, but the fear stopped him. What if it made things worse? What if she felt threatened all over again? What if the new man took action against him? The scenarios played endlessly in his head, each more terrifying than the last. Sleep became elusive. Nights were spent in a haze of fear, anxiety, and regret. He could no longer escape the consequences of his obsession. The thought that she could be safe, that she could be happy, no longer comforted him. Instead, it reminded him of his own helplessness. The realization that he had lost control and could not regain it left him restless, jittery, and consumed by paranoia. At times, he tried to reach out to friends for advice, but the advice was always cautious, careful, and firm. They told him he needed to step back, to leave her alone, and to focus on himself. It sounded reasonable, but it also felt impossible. The fear of losing her completely, of her being with someone else, still held him hostage. One night, he decided to confront his own fears head-on. He sat alone, thinking about what he wanted, what he needed, and the reality of his situation. He realized that the obsession had become self-destructive. He was no longer thinking about her as a person, but as an object of control, a symbol of everything he could not have. The awareness was painful but necessary. The next few days were filled with inner struggle. He tried to distract himself with work, exercise, and other activities, but the pull of his fear and jealousy was relentless. Every social media update from her, every mention of her name in conversation sent his mind spiraling. The consequences of his past actions were now tangible, unavoidable, and inescapable. He began to notice the subtle ways the new man protected her. Even in casual interactions, it was clear that he commanded respect. that he was aware of her well-being, and that he would not tolerate anyone crossing boundaries. The realization deepened the ex-boyfriend's fear. He understood now that any confrontation, any attempt to threaten or control her, would be met with immediate and potentially serious consequences. Days turned into weeks, and he became increasingly aware of the tightrope he was walking. He could not allow himself to slip back into obsession, but the temptation was always there, lurking at the edges of his thoughts. The fear of consequences had grown stronger than anger or jealousy, but it was still accompanied by a gnawing sadness and longing he could not shake. In moments of quiet reflection, he realized the extent of the damage he could have caused, the danger he had put himself in, and the threat he had posed to her peace of mind. The consequences were real, immediate, and unavoidable. The awareness was humbling, frightening, and painful, but it also marked the beginning of a slow, cautious understanding that he needed to change, that he could not continue down the path he had started on. Even as he wrestled with his fears, he saw glimpses of what life could be like if he chose differently. If he stepped back, respected her life and choices, and focused on his own growth, perhaps he could regain a sense of stability. The realization was not comforting, it was sobering, but it was a start. The consequences of his actions had finally forced him to see the truth, to recognize the danger, and to confront the reality he had been avoiding for so long. He understood that the next steps would be critical. Every decision, every thought, every action would either deepen the consequences or help him regain control of his life. The awareness was heavy, but for the first time it brought a faint sense of clarity. He had survived the first wave of consequences, and now he had a chance to choose a different path, one that required courage, patience, and a willingness to let go of what he could not have. In the silence of his apartment, alone with his thoughts, he began to make a plan. Not to confront her, not to threaten, not to interfere, but to retreat, to heal, and to regain the life he had almost destroyed. The process would be slow, the temptation to relapse always present, but the consequences he had faced made the stakes clear. He could no longer afford to ignore the danger he had created, and he had no choice but to face the reality of his own actions and their impact on everyone involved. He had spent weeks trying to convince himself that he could remain distant, that he could let go of his obsession, but the reality was harder than he imagined. Every time he saw her, every time he caught a glimpse of her social media posts, every mention of her name in conversation, it felt like a physical blow. He knew he needed to stop, but the pull of curiosity and fear was almost unbearable. One afternoon, he found himself in a coffee shop near her workplace. He hadn't planned to go there, but the thought of seeing her again, even from a distance, was too strong to resist. He sat at a corner table, sipping his coffee, trying to appear casual, but his eyes couldn't stop scanning the room. Then he saw them. She was sitting across the room with the new man, laughing at something he had said. She looked relaxed, happy, and completely at ease. For a moment he froze. He had imagined this moment countless times, but seeing it in reality was different. The way the new man interacted with her, the calm confidence, the respect, the attention to her needs was intimidating. It was not the arrogance he had feared, nor the aggression he had imagined. It was quiet strength. Every gesture, every word spoke of someone who could protect her, someone she trusted deeply. Fear gripped him. He realized that he could never approach her now, never threaten her, never attempt to intervene. This man was not someone to confront, not someone to provoke. The reality of the situation sank in, a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He had been reckless, obsessed, and dangerous, and now he was powerless. He left the coffee shop, walking aimlessly through the streets, replaying every past action in his mind. The threats, the messages, the obsessive watching, all of it now seemed foolish and dangerous. He understood that he had underestimated the new man entirely. The awareness filled him with a mix of fear and regret. Days passed and he kept his distance, but he couldn't escape the thoughts. He tried to focus on work, on hobbies, on anything to distract himself, but the image of them together haunted him. He had to accept that she had found someone who could give her what he never could: safety, respect, and calm assurance. The reality was painful but undeniable. He began to see the consequences of his actions more clearly. His obsession had isolated him, driven away friends, and placed him on a dangerous path. He had been lucky that nothing worse had happened, that no physical confrontation had occurred. But the near misses, the warnings from friends, the subtle scrutiny of those around him were all signs of how close he had come to serious trouble. The fear was now accompanied by introspection. He thought about the person he had become in the last few months, angry, jealous, desperate, and how different it was from the person he wanted to be. He realized that if he didn't change, he would continue down a path of destruction, not just for himself but potentially for her as well. One evening, he sat alone in his apartment, thinking about the future. He knew he couldn't remain in this state forever. The obsession, the fear, the jealousy, they were chains that bound him to a dangerous cycle. He needed a way out, a way to reclaim his life without interfering with hers. He started small, taking walks without checking his phone constantly, avoiding social media for hours at a time and resisting the urge to follow her movements. Each small success gave him a fleeting sense of relief. He was learning slowly that letting go didn't mean giving up completely. It meant respecting boundaries and acknowledging reality. At work, he began to focus more, finding moments of clarity amidst the lingering anxiety. Tasks that had seemed impossible now felt manageable. The simple act of concentrating, of completing a project, gave him a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in months. Despite these small victories, the fear remained. Every unexpected noise, every glance from someone unfamiliar made him jump. He knew he had to keep his distance, that any misstep could reignite danger. The presence of the new man in her life was a constant reminder that he could not act recklessly, that he had to respect her boundaries no matter how painful it was. He thought often about apologies, not to her directly, but to himself and to those he had involved in his obsession, friends who had warned him, family who had worried, and even strangers who had noticed his behavior all deserved acknowledgement, even if only internally. He began to reflect on his actions with honesty, recognizing the patterns of thought that had led him astray. One night, he dreamed about confrontation, about stepping into her life, demanding answers and trying to assert control. But in the dream, the new man was always present, calm, unyielding, and unafraid. Every attempt to threaten or manipulate her ended with him being powerless, exposed, and alone. He woke with a start, heart racing, and realized that the dream was a warning, a reflection of reality he had to accept. In the weeks that followed, he practiced restraint. Every time the urge to contact her or investigate her life returned, he paused, breathed, and reminded himself of the consequences. He sought ways to channel his energy into healthier habits: exercise, reading, volunteering, and reconnecting with friends he had neglected. Each step was difficult, but each step was necessary. He also began to understand her perspective more deeply. She had moved on not to hurt him, but because she had the right to live her life fully. The new man was not a replacement, but a source of support she had chosen freely. Accepting this reality was painful, but it was a critical part of his own growth. As he reflected, he realized that his fear had been both a punishment and a teacher. It had forced him to confront the darkness in himself, to recognize the danger of obsession, and to understand the importance of respecting boundaries. The new man's presence had not only protected her, but had also inadvertently protected him from making a grave mistake. Gradually, he felt a shift. The intense fear began to soften, replaced by cautious respect for her choices and the life she was building. He understood that his actions no longer needed to define him, that he could step back, learn from his mistakes, and work toward becoming a more balanced, self-aware individual. He knew the journey would be long. The fear, the memories, and the lingering feelings of loss and regret would not disappear overnight. But for the first time, he felt a sense of possibility. He could reclaim his life not through control or threats, but through understanding, patience, and growth. The new man's quiet strength remained a looming presence in his mind, a reminder that he could not interfere. Yet it also became a symbol of what he could aspire to, not in taking her back, but in achieving calm confidence, self-respect, and the ability to face his own emotions without succumbing to obsession. In the solitude of his apartment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would step back, respect her life, and focus on his own. The lessons he had learned through fear and obsession would guide him, and although the pain of the past would remain, it would no longer control him. As he drifted to sleep that night, the fear lingered, but it was tempered by understanding. He had seen the consequences of his actions, faced the reality of the new man, and glimpsed the path toward self-restraint and growth. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he finally felt the possibility of moving forward, not as a man consumed by obsession, but as someone capable of learning, reflecting, and respecting the lives of others, including hers. The weeks passed slowly, each one bringing a mixture of relief and lingering tension. He had taken conscious steps to pull back from the obsession that had consumed him for months. Social media was checked far less often. Walks were taken without the constant urge to follow her movements, and he even began to answer the calls and messages of friends who had drifted away. Slowly, the weight of fear and anxiety started to lift, though it never disappeared entirely. He realized that healing was a process, not a sudden event. There were still moments when memories of her laughter, the way she smiled, or the small gestures they once shared would hit him like a wave. But now, instead of acting on them impulsively or obsessively, he would sit quietly and let the emotions pass. He began to journal, writing down thoughts that once would have led to messages or confrontations. Seeing his emotions on paper allowed him to understand them better and gave him a sense of control over his actions. She continued to live her life freely, oblivious to the intense turmoil that had once haunted him. He watched from a distance, not to control or manipulate, but to witness that she was safe and genuinely happy. There was a strange mix of relief and sadness in seeing her with the new man. Relief because he knew she was protected and cared for. Sadness because he had been removed from her world in ways he couldn't undo. Over time, he began to confront the deeper reasons behind his obsession. It was not just about losing her, he realized. It was about his fear of being powerless and alone. He had attached so much of his identity to their relationship that losing her had left a void he didn't know how to fill. Understanding this allowed him to focus on himself, to rebuild a sense of self that wasn't dependent on anyone else. He started to pursue old hobbies and interests he had abandoned. Reading, jogging, and cooking became small but meaningful ways to occupy his mind and regain a sense of accomplishment. He joined a local club to meet people casually, not with the intention of dating, but simply to reconnect with life outside of his obsession. The simple act of interacting with others, sharing laughter, and engaging in conversations helped remind him that the world was bigger than the focus on one person. In his moments of quiet reflection, he thought often about what he had learned from the experience. The threats, the messages, and the obsessive thoughts had brought him close to serious consequences, both legally and personally. The fear he had felt, the fear of retaliation, the fear of being watched, the fear of losing control, had been an unwelcome teacher but a necessary one. It forced him to recognize the mistakes he had made and the patterns he needed to break. He also acknowledged the role of the new man in her life. At first, that acknowledgement had been terrifying, but over time it became a symbol of what he needed to learn. The quiet strength, respect, and calm confidence that the new man embodied were qualities he aspired to develop in himself. It wasn't about competing or reclaiming anything. It was about understanding the value of restraint, patience, and self-control. One day he ran into a mutual friend who casually mentioned seeing her at a nearby park. Normally he might have been tempted to go see her, to check on her, to satisfy some lingering curiosity. But this time he smiled politely, acknowledged the comment, and continued on his way. That small act felt monumental. It was a tangible sign that he had begun to change, that the lessons of fear and consequence had sunk in enough for him to act differently. He began to rebuild connections with people he had distanced himself from. Friends were cautious at first, but they appreciated his effort to engage without obsession. Family noticed the change as well, a subtle but steady improvement in his mood, behavior, and approach to life. Slowly, he learned to trust that healthy relationships could exist without control or manipulation. Though he had made significant progress, the awareness of his past behavior remained with him. He reflected often on the messages he had sent, the thoughts that had driven him to surveillance, and the obsessive fantasies that had plagued him. Each reflection reinforced the lessons he had learned. He understood that the desire to control or threaten someone out of fear or jealousy was dangerous and destructive. Accepting that he could no longer influence her life was difficult, but necessary. He began volunteering at a local community center, helping people with small tasks and engaging in projects that allowed him to give back. The sense of purpose was soothing, a way to redirect energy that had once been consumed by obsession into something positive and meaningful. It reminded him that life could be fulfilling without holding on to the past or trying to control others. Over time, his thoughts of her became less intense. They still surfaced occasionally, especially when he remembered certain shared moments, but the feelings no longer demanded action or caused panic. He had learned to observe emotions without being ruled by them, a skill that slowly built confidence and resilience. He also thought about forgiveness, both hers and his own. While she may never have known the extent of his obsession, he needed to forgive himself for the actions he had taken. Accepting responsibility internally, without excusing the behavior, allowed him to release some of the guilt that had weighed heavily on him. It was not easy, but it was necessary for his growth. Months passed, and he noticed a subtle shift within himself. Anxiety no longer dominated his days. The fear of consequences had transformed into a quiet vigilance, a reminder to act responsibly and thoughtfully. He had grown more aware of his own emotional triggers and had learned to manage them before they spiraled out of control. He occasionally imagined her life, not as a threat or a source of jealousy, but as a reminder that people can find happiness even when relationships end. The thought was bittersweet, but it brought a sense of peace. He could accept that she had moved on and that he had no power over that choice. The new man, once a figure of fear, now represented the stability and calm that life could offer when approached with respect and patience. In moments of solitude, he often reflected on the contrast between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. The journey had been painful, full of fear, obsession, and consequences, but it had also been instructive. He had learned about the dangers of jealousy and obsession, the importance of boundaries, and the value of self-awareness. He had also learned patience, the ability to wait, to observe without acting impulsively, and to accept that some things are beyond his control. This lesson was perhaps the most valuable, as it applied not only to relationships but to life in general. By the end of the year, he felt a quiet sense of closure. The obsession that had once controlled him was no longer dominant. He had rebuilt parts of his life that had been neglected, formed healthier routines, and gained insight into his own behavior. The fear of consequences had evolved into wisdom, guiding him to act with care and restraint. He understood that he could never erase the past, but he could shape his future. The experiences with obsession, fear, and realization had taught him lessons that he would carry forward. They had been painful but necessary, shaping a version of himself that was stronger, more self-aware, and capable of acting responsibly. In his quiet moments, he allowed himself to feel gratitude, not for the loss or the fear, but for the lessons learned, the growth achieved, and the chance to start anew. He understood that life continued, not always as he had planned, but in ways that could bring unexpected strength and resilience, and so, he moved forward carrying the memory of the past as a guide rather than a burden. He had learned to let go, to respect boundaries, to face consequences with honesty, and to prioritize growth over control. Life was not perfect, but it was his to navigate. And for the first time in months, he felt a sense of hope and clarity about the road ahead. The fear, the obsession, and the loss had not defeated him. They had taught him to survive, reflect, and grow into a better version of himself.